fellow Earthlings. What a joy to be with you today. I want to tell you about how a wonderful sovereign nation in the desert southwest of the United States thinks about history. The Apache, the White Mountain Apache. They actually don't tell history through time. So you know how we tell history and how we learned it in school. So we know when Hitler died and when World War II started and when the pyramids were built. But the Apache tell history through space and naming places. They say that wisdom sits in places. Wisdom sits in places. All they have to do is name a place, and they know the entire story that goes with it, and then the ethic out of which we should live by naming that place. How different it is than a timeline, which does not carry wisdom. It does not carry wisdom in the same deep way that is embedded in the landscape of the White Mountain Apache. I thought about this way of telling history when I was called a year ago to do some work for an environmental group and in conjunction with some Aboriginal communities up near the Arctic Circle. And it was around an abandoned gold mine. And what I was asked to do was to draft the principles of perpetual care for that mine. Now, what are those? I didn't really know. So I began work looking at how other places, like Chernobyl, or the WIPP site in New Mexico, which takes transuranic waste from the military, thinks about this long-term care of these kinds of facilities. Now, it turns out that the mine that I was interested in developing these principles for is called the Giant Mine. It's an abandoned gold mine, and it's called a giant mine, or the giant mine, for a very good reason. It has 237,000 tons of arsenic trioxide that they blew back into the mine. And then thousands of acres covered with mine tailings, and the arsenic, and the lead, and the asbestos that went along with the buildings cover the landscape and poison the water. And how, we wonder, do we warn future generations of that kind of terrible tragedy? How do we do that? And I thought, how do we turn this tragedy of something that will last for so long into a place where wisdom sits? I began looking at these other sites, Chernobyl, Fukushima, Love Canal, and asked, how do they warn future generations? How do they hold the memory of this place so that they can tell the story? And I went to the WIPP site first and read that that material will be toxic for 250,000 years. I'll do the math for you. 25 years per generation, that's 10,000 generations. 10,000 generations that we are creating tragedies. We are leaving tragedies to 10,000 generations. I went into despair. Terrible despair. What were we leaving future generations? I'm a lawyer. My clients are future generations, and this is what we are doing? So I began the work on drafting these principles of perpetual care. And the reason I'd been asked, actually, is because I'd been doing some work on something called the precautionary principle. And it's just what it sounds. You take precautions in the face of scientific uncertainty and the likelihood of harm. Now, those of you in environmental law and policy know that the precautionary principle is actually an idea that's been put into place in international treaties. It governs California law. And I've actually been at work on this for a long time. So I knew how to prevent harm. We know how to do this. And the reason I was thinking about the 250,000 years and the 10,000 generations is because other indigenous friends of mine said, well, you know, Carolyn, this idea of the precautionary principle is actually the seventh generation rule. Well, the seventh generation rule comes from the Iroquois Confederacy, and they said, you know, if you're going to make wise decisions, you consider the seventh generation. And we are now leaving things to the 10,000th generation? Is this an insanity or what? So we had developed all of the ways of putting into place the precautionary principle. I held a big conference on this in 1998, and we figured out how to do this, how we prevent harm. Well, we know how to heed early warnings. What are the trend lines in science? What's happening with breast cancer or ocean acidification, or deforestation, or autism, the increases in autism, or breast cancer. I'll give you a statistic. When my mom got married, and I'm not telling you how old I am, 1 woman in 25 got breast cancer. Guess what the statistic is now? 1 woman in 8. Between me and my mother, we don't have a genetic change. Something else is at work. So for applying the precautionary principle, we heed early warnings and those trends. And then we set goals. Can we reverse those trends so that we have healthy people? I could give you statistics about childhood cancers, childhood birth defects. I could go through the roster, the litany of environmental tragedies. But we can pay attention to those and we can set goals. We know how to do that. We know how to reverse some of those and take action to prevent harm. So we heed early warnings, we set our goals, and then if we have a harmful activity, we can look for a better alternative. And then we choose it. We actually have this built into law in California or the federal government. We do an environmental impact statement and look at the activity that's proposed, and then we have to evaluate the alternatives. Makes sense. Want to know a shocking fact? There is not a single legal jurisdiction in the United States that compels us to choose the best alternative. But the precautionary principle says you look for the best alternative and you choose it. Is this a pesticide that is causing damage to people, to birds, another kind of people? Is it damaging the oceans, the waterways? What's a better alternative? What's a better way that we can do business to raise our food or to create healthy children? How can we do that? The best alternative. That choosing the best alternative is really at the heart of the precautionary principle. And then there's another common sense idea, which goes by the rather convoluted name of reversing the burden of proof. So there are some lawyers in the audience, and you know what I'm talking about, but so do you parents. So reversing the burden of proof means when your kid comes home late, you're not the one who has to take responsibility for the explanation. And you're not the one who's responsible for cleaning up your 14-year-old's room. They're responsible for their own messes. Imagine holding industry responsible for their own messes. Polluter pays. That's part of the reversing the burden of proof. It's making companies and industries test their products before they put them on the market. We hold people responsible for their actions in the world. That's reversing the burden of proof. But what's so interesting about the precautionary principle is that I was not told that we could use ethics when I began my environmental work a long time ago. I was told we could only have science make the decisions. So we were going to test things, we were going to come up with a risk assessment, and then we were going to decide whether that risk was acceptable. I don't know about you, but another breast cancer in my family is not acceptable. Another birth defect is not acceptable. Loss of fisheries is not acceptable. But that's how we make our decisions. We say, well, we want to privilege the economy. The economy gets the benefit of the doubt, not your baby. Not this gorgeous ocean and those whales. They don't get the benefit of the doubt. The economy gets the benefit of the doubt. But we don't have to do it that way. We can act grounded in an ethic and marry that with the best science we've got. How would we do that? And what is the ethic in something like the precautionary principle? Well, we didn't know when we began. Environmental ethics was not a field that really applied much to the kind of work that I did when I began environmental law and policy. And so, okay, the precautionary principle means you prevent harm. And then it was obvious to us what the precautionary principle really was. It's the idea that we can take care of future generations, that we prevent harm in the future in the face of scientific uncertainty, that we will be beloved ancestors, and we will leave this earth, these oceans, this planet in better shape than we got it. That's at the heart of the ethic of the precautionary principle. And that giant mine is a failure of our generation. And it's a failure of government. What government would permit that kind of damage that would last 10,000 generations? Well, we don't have a good theory of government right now floating around. I want to offer you one. And you know what's really beautiful? Some of it has pieces in the Hawaiian Constitution. So it says that government is responsible as the trustee of the commons, these things that we share, air, water, wildlife. And government's responsibility as the trustee is to conserve it and turn it over to future generations intact. The Constitution is beautiful. And guess what the Hawaii Supreme Court said? You have to use the precautionary principle to carry out that provision. Isn't that a wonderful way of putting them together? Yes. Wisdom sits in Hawaii out of that decision. It was a Supreme Court case about the Waiahole Ditch, and it allocated water to indigenous farmers and took some water away from big agriculture and golf courses and things like that. And it said, this water belongs to the people of Hawaii, to this generation and to future generations. What a beautiful thing. So if we're not going to leave a legacy of tragedy to the 10,000th generation, and we are going to be able to leave beauty to the 7th generation and to the 10,000th generation and the 10,000th generation beyond that, can we invent new institutions? I believe we can. You know, Ben Franklin invented the public library, the fire department. We're at a point where we need all sorts of new imagination in our governance. Imagine this. Imagine that we actually designated legal guardians for future generations. Imagine that. Imagine what they would do. Imagine you being the voice of future generations. We could house them at the Department of Justice. At this time, there are ombudsmen at the Department of Justice of the United States that review all regulations for their impact on small business. But a guardian for future generations could review all regulations from EPA, from FDA, from the Department of the Interior, all of them, for their impact on future generations. And if we take care of future generations, then we are likely to also take care of this generation, to have clean air and clean water for this generation. Imagine that future generations actually had rights. They had a right to be born without being polluted. Imagine that we moved environmental law out of free market private property law and moved it into rights law, and we said, you have a right to a clean and healthy environment, and we can extend that to future generations. And then we begin to create a law of sharing. We share the commonwealth. We share it. We share the air and water. We share wildlife, and they share this with us. We have rights with the polar bear and the land to a stable climate. Imagine that. Imagine that. So, the guardian can review regulations for their impact on future generations, and they can do an audit of the commons, all these things that we share, and report it as part of their fiduciary responsibility. Fiduciary is the word that says they've got the responsibility for this to report it to us and to care for it in the way that a trustee cares for it. We can do that. We can launch a civil rights movement for future generations that allows us to be beloved ancestors. You, oh you, my dear, dear friends and allies, we are the beloved ancestors. The small things and the large things that you do matter in this world. They matter. They matter to future generations. You know, a lot of times people ask me if I have hope. And they ask me because I work on things like the giant mine. I do not have hope in the sense of optimism. I do not know that things are going to turn out all right. But Václav Havel, the president of Czechoslovakia, who died just recently, said that hope is not optimism. It is the deep orientation of the soul towards what is right. My compass direction of my soul is future generations. But what I know is that alone is not enough. That is not enough for that kind of hope. That's a little bit grim. It's a little bit grim to think I'm the only one, or it's dependent on my soul being pointed in the right direction. But what I know is that so many of us have that same pull, that same call to be beloved ancestors, to do some of the hard things, some big things, some small things, and they matter. And so I believe even more than hope, I believe that there's grace in this world. Grace is that surprising, mysterious good that arises out of all of these actions, arises out of the surprising places. And for that, I thank you. You are the faces of grace to me. And for that reason, because you are the beloved ancestors with me walking this path, I know that we can do this. The future is here. Thank you.